David, take it away.
All right, thank you, John. Well, good morning, and I would like to also welcome everyone to the first in a series of webinars that AccessIT Group is going to be presenting, hopefully bringing both information and insight on different topics across the cybersecurity spectrum. We're excited to be a part of this presentation and part of this program overall, and we're also happy to be associated with these partners. We're glad to be hopefully providing some additional value to the cybersecurity community overall. So first, a little bit about AccessIT Group, for those of you who may not know us very well. We are a cybersecurity VAR, and in today's world, that is not just a value-added reseller. We're a reseller with extended services capabilities. We're a solutions provider. We're that partner that can help to bring the pieces together when you have questions or issues related to cybersecurity. We're extremely flexible. We customize these solutions as we go. And we are regional, but we have a global reach. So we can work with enterprise level accounts. We can work with mid-caps, regionally focused, but with a very, very wide reach. And our people, you hear this a lot, our people make the difference. We have engineers that maintain the premium certifications across the industry. And we select very, very particularly the partners that we work with to bring these best of breed solutions as we work with our clients. A little history. We are not new to this industry. We have been around for 18 years. The key to this, though, is security isn't just a focus for us. Security is all that we do, and it's all that we've done since the beginning. So this is something we're extremely passionate about, and something that we've seen grow and change and evolve over the years. So the top 10 security projects as identified by Gartner for 2019. As you take a look at these, you can see that some of the project titles are not new. Some of these are things that we have seen before. Some of them are relatively new. The terminology may have changed somewhat, but the concept has not changed. What Gartner is pointing out when they produce these projects is, what is the thing that you can do to make the most positive impact on the overall security program? And all of these issues are very common, and they are found in a wide variety and wide range of organizations and verticals and sizes. So today we're going to focus on 3 of these projects. First, we're going to talk about privileged access management. And the project, as it's defined by Gartner, when they are talking about privileged access, we're talking about highly empowered accounts and how we can protect these accounts using a risk-based approach. And the privileged access accounts, these are very often a high target. This is something that any breach or hacker or attacker would want to get a hold of and gain access to those escalated or elevated privileges. These apply in a combination of either cloud, on-premise, hybrid situations. So it is still applicable very, very much across the board. Next, we're going to talk about a CARA-inspired vulnerability management program. What they refer to as a continuous adaptive risk and trust management approach. And that's a style of approaching vulnerability management based on the established value of IT assets to the business, and the understanding that not everything can be patched, not everything can be protected all at the same time. So it has to be prioritized. And then to understand the network topology, any changes to the infrastructure, to the environment that may also impact those vulnerabilities. And finally, we're going to talk about cloud security posture management. Cloud is hot. Everybody's talking about cloud. But nearly all the cloud attacks, and this is from the Gartner description, nearly all of the attacks are the result of customer misconfiguration, mismanagement, or mistakes. And a project to understand, to document, and to address the posture of your cloud security is something that can absolutely prevent those easily addressed mistakes or misconfigurations. And that's the subject of their project number 5, cloud security posture management. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over to John, who is going to get us started with our presentations.
David, thank you very much. And again, thank you for those introductions and that history of AccessIT. Coming up next to discuss privileged access management is Nick Dulevitz, Director of Solution Engineering for CyberArk. At this time, I'll have you go ahead and change presentation, Nick, and we can go ahead and begin. Again, just a reminder, as you have questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A session, and we will address those in the fourth quarter of our presentation today.
And I just shared my screen out. Can you see it?
Yes, we can. It is in next slide or presentation mode. You may want to go to full slideshow mode.
Thanks. Hold on one second. I just have to change screens. New share. All right. Better now?
Quite good. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much. And thank you to AccessIT for hosting the webinar today. My name is Nick Dulevitz. I am the Director of Solutions Engineering for the channel for CyberArk, responsible for the United States and Canada. The topic that I'll be covering today is privileged account security, or privileged access security. So why is privileged account security or privileged access security on Gartner's top 10? Well, it's because privileged credentials, privileged access is leveraged by both insiders and outsiders, or external threats and insider threats, to be able to pull off the attack that they're trying to pull off, right? Privileged credentials are what's required to be able to log into that database and steal data, or log into that domain controller, or your AWS instance, or your GitHub repo, hopefully, right? Not always the GitHub repo, unfortunately, but what's in the GitHub repo that was stolen were privileged credentials that then that attacker can use to do something that they shouldn't, well, that I guess from an attacker's perspective, they should be doing it. But from our perspective, we certainly don't want them doing it, right? So what I have up on the screen here, just to kind of illustrate that that is in fact the case, right? These are some breaches. These are some real world breaches that have happened, you know, over the last 12 to 18, 24 months. So these are all things that are public. They've been in the news, and they all involve privileged credentials of some kind, right? It's a very real thing. So how does CyberArk address this? Well, we do it a few ways, right? But primarily what we do is we take those privileged accounts that are being used in the organization, and we place controls around them, right? So we'll discover them, for one thing. Most customers, most clients don't know where all of their privileged accounts are, right? They might have a spreadsheet with some of them, but they don't know where every single one is. So one of the things that we need to be able to do is have a method that we can leverage to be able to find privileged credentials in the environment. To find them, what we do with them, but we store them secure
Nick,
repository that we call our security.
I apologize, Nick. This is John Raymond, facilitator for AccessIT, jumping in. We're having some audio issues with your presentation. Do you think you're fading in and out? The audio levels are changing. Do you think you could check that for us?
Yep, absolutely. Is this any better?
That is the best quality we've heard, yes.
This is the best you've heard. Okay, no problem. All right, so let's see, where were we? So we were talking about privileged credentials and where they're leveraged within an attack, right? So again, an attacker is going to try to leverage privileged credentials to get access to the places where the important data is stored, right? So whether that is the database or the domain controller to print out access, wherever it may be, right? So CyberArk addresses those in a number of different ways. First of all, the first thing that we have to do is help to find privileged credentials within a customer's environment, right? So most often when we discuss with a client, how many privileged credentials do you have? What types of systems do you have? Where are they all? Most of the time, customers, and really, in fact, all the time, customers don't know where they all are, right? So the first thing you have to do is to help them to discover them. So within our solution, we have built-in discovery functionality that we can leverage to find the privileged credentials within a customer's environment. And then once we find them, what do we do with them? Well, we want to be able to define access controls around them, right? Who can access these credentials and use them for whatever it is that their job function requires that they use them for, right? And without a solution like CyberArk in place, what we often see is a piece of paper, right? There's a policy in place that users agree to, privileged users within the environment agree to, and they say, we're only going to leverage these credentials for the things that we should leverage them for, right? Well, it's all well and good, but we know that as human beings, it's pretty easy for maybe John, the Linux admin, who today needs to log into a Windows server for some reason, maybe valid, maybe not. He pops his head up over the cubicle and he says to Larry, "Hey, can I get the local admin credential for Win Server 002?" And Larry says, "Hey, John, yep, absolutely. How are the kids? Good, awesome. All right, here's your password." And then John goes and he does whatever he needs to do with that particular credential. And again, it might be completely on board and John has no malicious intent, but the thing I'm trying to illustrate here is that without controls in place, these users can do whatever they want to do with these individual credentials. So again, we'll discover the credentials. We'll define ACLs around who's allowed to access them. So we can do things like, only the Linux administrators are able to access Linux credentials. Only the Windows administrators are able to access Windows credentials. And then additionally, right, the other thing, one of the other things that we'll do is we'll manage these credentials. And when I say manage, what do I mean? Well, I mean that we'll put a policy in place that tells the CyberArk solution within that customer's environment to change these passwords every 30 days, every 60 days, every 90 days, and to set the complexity at a certain level, right? 30 characters, 5 upper, 5 lower, 5 dig, 5 special kind of thing. And then what's going to happen is when the system goes out and changes that password for the first time, now our end user community, they no longer know the password values. So they have to come to CyberArk every time they want to use a credential. And that means that we're also going to always have an audit record, and we're going to have centralized control and the ability to revoke access based on what we're seeing within the environment. So we're going to discover, we're going to define ACLs, we're going to manage, and then the other two things that are primary kind of pillars of the CyberArk solution are involved workflows. So we might say that before a particular user is able to access a credential, or maybe maybe they need to view a credential in clear text because there's a network interface card that's down on a server, but that user still needs to fix the server, right? That's their job. But rather than just allow them to view that credential in clear text, first we want them to put in a request to get access to the credential, and then we're going to have their manager approve that request, right? And then they can go ahead and they can do whatever they need to do, but we can tie additional workflows and controls around it. Additionally, from a workflow perspective, we can also tie in with a ticketing system like a ServiceNow and look at things like, hey, is this ticket assigned to this human user? Is it the account in question that the human user is trying to leverage? Are we in the change control window, right? All of those different things that are available from a ticketing system, right? We can pull in and say, okay, this looks like a legitimate access request. Let's go ahead and allow this user to perform the task that they need to carry out. And then, of course, we're going to introduce another layer of audit around all of that so that we can get a clear chain of custody around which users are performing which actions with privileged credentials and when did they do it, right? So that's an important piece. So far, right, I think I've really talked mostly about internal users that, again, may have malicious intent and may or may not. What about the bad actors on the outside that are trying to get into your organization and certainly break things or steal things and disrupt that business and have a negative press release, right, which we obviously want to avoid. So those bad guys, they're going to get into your environment. Typically, the thing that we see most often now is through social engineering. So they will go on to LinkedIn. They'll go to your company's corporate LinkedIn page. They'll pick 10 different users and they'll craft individual emails for each of those 10 users. They'll send those in and the latest statistic is 10%, right? 10% of spearfish emails get clicked on. Okay, well, as soon as that user clicks on that link in the email because there's a job offer or there's an alleged job offer making 50% more than you're making now, as soon as that user clicks on that link that the bad guy sent in, now the bad guy is running under the context of that user. Well, the good news there is that regular, well, hopefully regular, right? Because usually we're not leveraging a privileged credential to check our email and browse the web, right? We're usually using our standard user credential. So the good news there is that standard user credential probably can't do very much in the environment, right? It can do stuff on the workstation that it kind of sits on or other workstations if it's a domain account, which it probably is. But it probably can't log into a database server. It probably can't log into a domain controller, right? It probably can't do any of those things. So what's the attacker going to do? Well, in the cybersecurity world, the next step that we call it performing reconnaissance. That attacker is going to try to learn about your environment. They're going to use regular tools that don't require privilege, like PowerShell as an example, to run queries, right? They're going to look at things like maybe your host name schema, and they're going to see that you have a server called SQL 001. I bet that's a SQL server. That might be something that I want to target. They're going to find out where your domain controllers are. They're going to find out what groups and accounts exist in the environment and what rights those groups and accounts have. So they're going to pick their targets, and then they're also going to choose the leverage, which in this case the leverage is the privileged account that they're going to use to be able to exploit those targets, right? So they're going to that perform reconnaissance step is where they're starting to, again, plan out their attack and learn about your environment. So how do they do that, right? How do they get from the workstation, even when they're kind of looking around and they're saying, okay, there's credentials here, there's systems here. How do they actually move off of that workstation layer and get to that database server that we talked about? Well, there's a number of different ways, but one of the major ways that we see today would be through something like a pass the hash vulnerability on a Windows system. And pass the hash on Windows is simply when another user logs into your Windows system, they expose their password on that system. So an attacker sitting on that box where the other user logs in can steal that user's credential. And if that user has privileged access, now they can start to go wherever that privileged user can go. And that's just one of many ways that users can steal credentials, or that attacker can steal credentials, right? So what we want to do with CyberArk is we want to be able to not just place those controls that I talked about already, but we also want to monitor continuously what's happening with privileged accounts within the environment. We want to be able to say, this is what a normal behavioral pattern looks like. John uses these 5 credentials between 9 and 5 East Coast time, X number of times per day, and they go, when he goes to these individual IPs, right? That's what John's normal behavioral pattern looks like. Well, all of a sudden, John is operating outside of that normal behavioral pattern because it's probably not John, right? So what are we going to do? Well, first of all, we're going to detect that and we're going to alert you. But then the other thing that we're going to be able to do with the solution is we're going to be able to do what CyberArk does, right? Which is change passwords. We manage these credentials. So as soon as we see that all of a sudden that this user that should be John, but looks like he's not, is doing things that John definitely doesn't normally do, we're going to change that password. So if it is an attacker moving through your network and jumping from Windows workstation to Windows server to database server, we're going to, once we change that password, they can no longer leverage that credential to continue to move laterally through the environment. And that's what we call that hopping, right? We call that lateral movement. So that's kind of how CyberArk addresses these things. And one other thing I want to point out, you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen here, the on-prem, the hybrid, and the cloud, all of our solutions can be set up either 100% on-prem, right? So you can run the entire thing in your on-prem kind of traditional brick and mortar data center. It can be run 100% in the cloud in AWS, in Azure, or in GCP. Or it can be run in a hybrid environment, right? Where you have some of the components sitting on-prem and some of the components sitting in the cloud. Privileged accounts, where do they exist? Well, they exist everywhere, right? Mostly what I've talked about today has been Windows and Unix and Linux, but they're on network devices. They're in your applications. They're in the cloud, right? And then one area that we don't think of a lot when it comes to privileged credentials is, there's also a social media presence, right? Most corporations today have, Facebook and Twitter accounts, and they have somebody probably from marketing who manages those credentials. I'm sorry, not manages those credentials, who manages those accounts, right? And they go on and they post, hey, look at what we achieved from a business perspective or within the community and all these hopefully positive things. Well, what happens if that marketing person, has a bad day and they leave the company on bad terms and they go to the Starbucks around the corner and they log into the Facebook or the Twitter or both and start posting things like, bad language or corporate secrets or whatever it might be? We certainly want to keep that from happening. So that's a different example of a privileged credential, but all of the things that I've talked about today, CyberArk, has out-of-the-box integrations where we can start to manage those privileged credentials and provide secure access around the credentials on those platforms. We in fact have integrations out of the box with hundreds of different platforms. Not all platforms, right? Because we can't support everything out of the box. So that being said, we're a plug-in based system, right? So if there's something that you guys even developed, within your corporate kind of environment, right? You built your own software, it has credentials associated with it. We can even build plugins to manage the stuff that you're building yourself. And then my last slide here real quick, just to talk about the different product offerings and sort of how those things are licensed. It's really all kind of around our core offering, which we call core privileged access or privileged account security. And there's a few different components based around core paths. One is our secure digital vault. One is our session management solution. Another one is our analytics engine. And then another thing here that I haven't mentioned today is when we're going to change credentials, usernames, and passwords, we're also going to be able to manage SSH keys. We can rotate SSH keys, generate new pairs, set those keys on target systems, and allow applications to be able to leverage them as well. And speaking of allowing applications to be able to leverage them as well, we do, of course, also offer app-to-app solutions, and then a least privileged solution for your endpoints. So for your Windows, for your Mac, and for your Linux and Unix endpoints, we have a solution that allows you to remove administrative rights for your end users, right, on their systems, but still empower them to be able to do the specific individual tasks that require privilege on that box that are also required for their job function, right? Maybe you've got a sales guy who needs to install a printer. Installing a printer is actually an administrative level task, right? But you don't want that to generate a help desk ticket every time and to waste help desk officers' time and to waste that user's time. You can create a policy that says this user doesn't have admin, but they can transparently escalate to admin to be able to perform specific functions. And that's everything that I had today. I apologize for the audio issues earlier on, but thank you very much for the time, and I'm going to hand it back to AccessIT.
Nick, thank you very much. I think we all learned a great deal about privileged access management and security. At this time, I would like to go ahead and invite Mike Morgan, the Senior Solutions Engineer for CyberArk, to begin his presentation on Carta-inspired vulnerability management. Mike?
All right, thank you. Pulling up my PowerPoint right now. We'll go through a couple quick slides. and then we'll hop in and press some buttons and see kind of the proof in the pudding here, so to speak. First thing we want to cover, obviously, at Tenable, the main thing that we do is vulnerability management. I think historically we look at some of the ways that we've gone about management as an industry. Kind of needed some next generation type functionality. And we looked at it from two perspectives. First, we looked at it from what we call cyber exposure. And we see it as this new emerging discipline where we're really taking it beyond just vulnerability management on traditional IT and looking at everything across the full scope of business, cloud, containers, all of that stuff. But more importantly, to kind of flip vulnerability management on its historical head and look at everything from a cyber risk perspective. So there's four real essential questions that we're focused on in everything that we're doing going forward. Where are we exposed? What should we focus on first? And those are two sort of innovations that we brought to the entire product stack from an enterprise perspective in the early portion of 2019. The next two are more specific to a new product that we just came out with last month called Lumen. So the other two questions, how are we reducing that exposure over time once we've identified what to fix first? And then how are we comparing with others in our industry as well as the aggregate population? So those are really the new things that we're focused on. As far as the product stack, you have Tenable SC, which is your on-prem vulnerability management enterprise console, and then you have Tenable IO, which is managed in the cloud. Both of those have access to, or the data from both of these get visualized in a module called Tenable Lumen. So Lumen is really sitting atop of the entire platform, looking at things from from the four questions that we just covered. What should I do first? What's most important? How am I doing over time? And what do I look like compared to everyone else? So think about Lumen as kind of the data analytics engine that makes sense of all the data that we're prioritizing for you in the enterprise products. The end game is to, of course, bring that across the scope and pull in all vulnerability data from all types of assets, including third-party ecosystems, both from an asset, a vulnerability, and threat perspective, to give you kind of a one place to stop to deal with all of that from a risk perspective. The long story short, so when we look at vulnerability management as an industry, CVSS came out, CVSS V2, V3, each of these were a little bit of an improvement, but historically the problem that we have, and we all know this, is there's an endless number of vulnerabilities that come out every single year that are disclosed. 59% of those actually fell into the critical or high category last year. So there's still, even if you just focus on those two severity levels, a ton of vulnerabilities to go after. At the end of all of that, only about 7% of those are actually seen as exploited in the wild. So what we wanted to do was look at some of the great things that CVSS scoring does and really come up with sort of a proprietary way to make that more focused on what actually is really, really relevant in an immediate sort of time period, rather than looking at all the noise of 17,000 plus vulnerabilities being created every year. So let's jump in real quick and kind of take a look at what that actually looks like in the products itself. I'll jump into Tenable SC first and take a look at that just to give you a visual of what that looks like, and then we'll kind of do the second part of this from Tenable IO's perspective when we look at Lumen. But to tell the story of vulnerability management, this is the exact same dashboard, and I created this as a custom piece in my environment to really show this off. This is the exact same data set, and I'm looking at criticals, highs, and mediums as defined by CVSS scoring. So you see my numbers. There's about 17,000 vulnerabilities that fall into this dashboard. Looking at the exact same data set from a vulnerability priority rating. So those are a couple, alphabet soup acronyms I'm going to hit you with today. The way that we make sense of what is most important to prioritize comes from our vulnerability priority rating feature. What that's doing is taking correlated threat intel and pushing it into the same plugin feeds that we give you every single night with updates and new plugins, and correlating that to the latest threat intel in the wild to see what's actually most impactful. And the difference between those two dashboards is this is traditional CVSS scoring. So, a 9.8 vulnerability that came out in 2015, with CVSS scoring, it's probably going to sit there at 9.8. It really doesn't change. It's more of a static scoring system. With vulnerability priority rating, these scores can change every single night. So you're always looking at what actually is real time. What's going on in the wild? What should I focus my efforts on today? And you can see when we correlate that vulnerability priority rating threat intel into the feed, I end up with about 11,000 vulnerabilities. So just off the top, and we're not getting into the informationals and all those types of things, the low vulnerabilities, this is just about a 40% difference in vulnerability reduction just by focusing on more of a real-time scoring system. So let's kind of go in, because when we introduced this, one of the first questions I had was, okay, well, I get the scoring, but someone's going to need to prove this to me. And we go in and look at one of the results here. to kind of get an idea of this. So we'll click into this Microsoft vulnerability, latest patch. We'll look at the vulnerability details, and this will tell the actual story of vulnerability priority rating. So remember, vulnerability priority rating is available in both enterprise products. There's no additional charge for that sort of feature set. But what we're doing is looking at how Tenable is scoring this. So it's your same traditional scoring as CVSS has always had, 0 to 10. But what we're doing is looking at it from a real-time perspective. So you see on this individual vulnerability, the actual difference between CVSS v3 base score is an 8.1. Still a prominent issue, but not necessarily something that you would go after maybe like a 3-day SLA. But the way we see it at Tenable, based on the latest threat intel and you know, the types of data points that we're pulling in, and there's about 150 different individual data points from a research perspective that we pull in to kind of come up with our vulnerability priority rating score. But we see that as a 9.8. So that, according to most of our SLAs, should probably get a lot more attention and really be something that we'd focus on for triage. And when we come down to kind of the reasons why that score is 9.8, we can see it's exploitable. We can see all the different things it's exploitable with. We can go down to the key drivers. So the key drivers are a set of 7 specific things that we kind of bring to the surface to give, you know, the consumer some confidence in what we're saying. And you can see the reason we score that so high is because A, this has been a vulnerability out in the marketplace for a long period of time. It's CVSS impact score. So think about your impact scores, your confidentiality, your integrity, and your availability. If this vulnerability does get exploited on this host, what's the expected loss? What's the potential for loss? And on our 0 to 10 scoring system, that CVSS impact score is really out of 6. So that's a 5.9 out of 6. And then the other 4 points are, of course, our proprietary stuff that we do on the back end. And you can see the exploit code maturity is high. The product coverage, that refers to how many different products this individual vulnerability affects. The threat intensity, the recency, and the threat sources really give you some identification of why this vulnerability should be prioritized for important triage. So that's really what we do from an enterprise product perspective to answer those first 2 questions. You know, where am I exposed and how am I, you know, what should I prioritize in terms of fixing that? If we go over to Tenable.io and we'll kind of look at our new product, our new module, which is Lumen. And again, this is the data analytics engine that sits over top of both enterprise platforms. This is presenting risk in a new way. So instead of dealing with historical numbers of vulnerabilities that we're always chasing, what we really want to focus on now is prioritizing actual risk. And we put that in the calculation of a 0 to 1,000 calculation here. I'll hover over this so you can get a quick sense of it. But what we're doing is marrying 2 things together. We're taking the vulnerability priority rating that we already have available in the products, and we're tying it to an asset criticality rating that is Tenable derived or customer customized. So really quickly digging into that, I'll give you an example of what that is. If we go in here to the asset view, each one of my assets has an ACR, an asset criticality rating, and I'll go ahead and edit this one. We'll drill and kind of look at it. What we're doing is about 200 or 250 or so plugins that we can utilize in this case, where we can automatically look at the plugin results that come back from a scan on a host and say, you know, with the information that we gathered, we can approximately say this is this type of risk on a 0 to 10 scale. So, and we expose, just like we did the vulnerability priority rating drivers, we expose the asset criticality rating drivers right here so you can get a sense of what this is. So you can see device type, internet exposure, and device capability are the 3 things that we're looking at. So this is a general purpose server, device capabilities at DNS, it's a DHCP, what does it do? And then where does it sit in terms of the network? So what we're doing is taking that automated approach to really give customers an understanding out of the box, right out of the gate, of what we think a relevant assets criticality might be. Now, of course, at the end of the day, that's always going to be a customer-derived decision. You're going to use your business impact analysis and all the other things that you've done to quantify what risk is or what the criticality of our individual assets and environments across your enterprise. But this gives you the ability to come in either proactively, or you can do it right in the middle of the workflow to come in here on an individual basis and say, you know, it's not really that important because it's in a dev environment. And it's got, you know, we'll say dev, and it's got existing mitigation controls already applied. Let me make that calculation and save that and make that change, and it becomes a customized score. So going back to Lumen, that's essentially what that 0 to 1,000 calculation is. It's an indicator of actual risk based on all of the vulnerabilities that have a vulnerability priority rating and the asset criticalities that we've taken into account, either automated or through customized stuff. And you can click on that, and this will give you an idea of specifically what assets comprise your cyber exposure score, what vulnerabilities comprise that cyber exposure score, and then you can benchmark against whatever industry you want to put yourself in. For me, it's public services, so I can see against my industry, I'm actually doing substantially better than everyone else. Against the Tenable aggregate population, I'm not doing quite as well as I was against the public services, but I'm still doing fairly decently. And then we're tracking and trending this information over time. You know, Lumen is only about 6 to 8 weeks old for us now, so there's some things that we're working on in the short term, such as enumerating what assets and vulnerability counts are associated with this trend line over time. And you can go ahead and make this chart easier to read, depending upon who you're presenting it to, by simply clicking or unclicking the relevant benchmark statistics. Now, the bottom piece is kind of an extension of that. One of the first things that customers always want to do is really understand, you know, I have a 557, that's great across my organization, but I don't really know what to do with that. So one of the things we wanted to do was create an internal benchmarking system where you can use the tags, the tag capabilities that are inherent in Tenable.io to actually quantify your different assets. This is this environment, this is this operating system, you know, make sense of all of these things using tags, and then you can pull those existing tags from Tenable.io into Lumen, where you can expose kind of a report card sort of view where you're able to look at cyber exposure score across these individual assets. How many licensed assets comprise this? What makes up this bunch? And then what's the individual cyber exposure score associated with each one of these units? So you can see for me, I'm doing fairly well as an organization, but I do have one area that's actually really bad from a remediation perspective. Understandably, Adobe's primarily an issue for everybody, but that's really my weak point. So this is really the executive view. It's giving you the ability to identify what risk is, set goals. You know, we don't want to be 557, we want to be 525. And some of the things we'll go forward will be actually applying. So if we click into this data, it gets down to kind of the managerial director view, where you're looking at your specific environment. So this is all related to the operating systems in my environment that are Linux. And I can see very specifically from a remediation perspective, what's the best bang for the buck? What's the 1 or 2 or 5 things that I should do today that would have the biggest impact? And what you'll see here coming probably toward the end of the year will be a cyber exposure reduction column that actually shows you what degree of reduction of your cyber exposure score would be obtained by going after this individual remediation. And then down at the bottom and kind of the side view here are a couple other widgets that we're looking at. One of the other things you'll see coming out fairly soon is called assessment maturity. We're taking these 3 widgets. It's really a combination of saying, don't just tell me I'm doing well or I'm doing bad on my vulnerability management, but really tell me, is it symptomatic? Is it something I'm doing from a process perspective? So what we're looking at with assessment maturity is how well you're scanning. How frequently are you doing it? How in-depth is it? Is it using all the plugins that are available, or are you just using subsets of plugins? And are you authenticating? At the end of the day, are you able, when that auditor comes in, are you able to quantify your environment? There's 6% of my entire environment here that's completely unclassified. So all I'm doing is looking at it from a Azure connector perspective. So I haven't done any active scanning on it yet. So you can really do triage off these boards as well. But that's really the scanning assessment maturity metric. We'll look at how frequently you're scanning, is it authenticated, what sort of plugin coverage are you looking at, to give you an idea on these tag individual bases, you know, where you're scanning appropriately and where there's room for improvement. With that, I'll turn it over to AccessIT.
Well, Mike, thank you very much. I do appreciate that. I know I learned a lot, especially about prioritization through criticality and eliminating some of that background noise. So thank you very much. As we transition to our final presenter, Livius Feinbaum, Principal Sales Engineer for Netskope, who will be addressing cloud security posture management. I did want to remind everyone that you can put your questions, and we do have one for the Q&A session at the end. Please feel free to go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A section at the bottom. So Livius, if you're ready, I'll go ahead and turn presentation over to you.
Wonderful. Can everyone hear me well?
Quite well, thank you.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. Livius Feinbaum, Principal SE at Netskope, in the focused on the New York metro area. Talk today is going to be about the Netskope Security Cloud for infrastructure as a service. So what are the challenges that are facing enterprises with the emergence of IaaS adoption? And it's really revolves around 3 areas: data loss, compliance, and exposure to threats. So misconfiguration or risky behavior can expose sensitive data. The need to maintain compliance of those configurations and that data, particularly across multiple cloud environments. These raise challenges, and finally, data in the cloud has, say, an increased exposure, and so vigilance over scanning for malicious payload is a third key area of concern. So with the Netskope Security Cloud, our core engine here is our Cloud XD, or Extreme Definition Engine. This is cloud native for the cloud security. This is an engine that understands API transactions, can detect and control them, as well as the JSON formatted data that those transactions carry. It serves as the underpinning for analytics, for policy, for data protection, and for threat protection to everything that Netskope offers. Our focus today, as I said, is going to be on infrastructure as a service. However, Cloud XD expands to various other cloud focuses, software as a service, web, private apps as well. And Cloud XD covers use cases from any combination of user, device, and location. So drilling into what we're going to talk about for infrastructure as a service from Netskope Security is really four silos, four domains. First, continuous security assessment. This is about monitoring configurations and inventory and compliance reporting on your AWS and your other IaaS providers, Azure, GCP. Second of the four is a real-time activity control, where a policy that can be set to be not only data aware, but API aware. It can be granularly defined to place controls that are unique compared to well-known perimeter implementations. And we'll give an example in a few slides of that kind of real-time control. As we see data moving into S3 buckets or Azure blobs and other object stores and IaaS services, it becomes increasingly important to be able to classify that data at rest in those cloud containers. And so Netskope does address that with award-winning Cloud DLP. And finally, with the ability to scan data for classification, we also offer the ability to detect malicious payload on the data, whether it is in motion to these IaaS services or at rest within the IaaS services. So let's start with the continuous security assessment. So this is a service that does continuous monitoring of security configurations across the IaaS vendors. Things like, is the public link accessible to the S3 bucket? Is 3389 open inbound from the broader internet? Baseline those configurations against best practices. These can be vendor-provided best practices. These can be objective third-party benchmarks like NIST or Center for Internet Security. And then, of course, provide remediation capabilities, centralized remediation to close those gaps, again, across AWS and other multi-cloud environments. So it does become a single dashboard that'll give one inventory of IaaS-based assets across all of the IaaS vendors, and also give a view of gaps, with compliance gaps, which means translates into different risks, and allows let's say, spinning of combinations of how you look at the data from an asset class perspective, from an IaaS vendor provider, from a compliance framework or set of gaps, various ways to analyze the data right in the product. There is not a requirement to get the data out into a third-party SIM or other kind of analytics tool, although that is supported. So let's talk a little bit about real-time activity control. This is the underpinning of the Cloud XD engine we talked about earlier. This becomes a real-time perimeter located in the cloud, and allows very granular kind of definitions of policy. So for example, identity can be based on user group or OU, location of where the endpoint is, where the user is at the moment, indication or detection of whether the device is corporate managed or if it is third party or a home office type of unmanaged device. Of course, the identification of the cloud service. Here we're showing IaaS services. Bear in mind this could be any web or SaaS or private app service as well. And when we're talking about the services, the apps that we're identifying, we're going, the Cloud XD is going a step deeper and actually looking at the individual web services that the app exposes. So for something like S3 buckets, the activity, the API detection can be a create, a delete, an upload, a sync, a copy, etc. So with that kind of granularity in your policy framework, you can come up with use cases such as Pat from DevOps from a coffee shop on a laptop using AWS to change S3 bucket configs. That's the kind of granular detection that Cloud XD enables. Now, why this is important, let's take a use case here. And this is kind of a breakdown of the last step that, in data exfiltration that occurred, and this is well documented. So this was the CAP1 breach. And the last step there was the data was moved from a corporate bucket to a non-corporate bucket. Let's analyze what's happening here, or for example, what happened in that breach. You have DevOps folks who are employees, and they're using, whether it's a web console or whether a CLI method, and their jobs are to administer corporate assets in the corporate accounts, buckets, databases, etc. Now, once granted access to AWS, there's a need to be able to provide access controls to corporate AWS versus personal or non-corporate third-party AWS. And this is where Netskope is able to step in and provide solutions with Cloud XD. Without this control, then the actor, the DevOps role, can do a north-south data exfiltration, downloading from the corporate buckets, and then subsequently uploading to the corporate buckets. Or the actor can do an east-west data movement, where a copy or a sync is issued to move data from a corporate bucket to a non-corporate bucket. And so with that analysis, we then identify where the Cloud XD real-time control would be placed with that granular policy, where uploads to non-corporate buckets or even east-west data syncs from corporate to non-corporate buckets, these kinds of controls can be put in place with Cloud XD. This is a prime example of a real-time control to mitigate risk that comes from IaaS adoption. So let's move on. Talk about data stored in S3 buckets or blobs or IaaS object stores in general. We combine the capabilities, the granularity of the Cloud XD engine with the award-winning Cloud DLP capability. And we really start by reducing surface area, where we simply block unauthorized IaaS accounts and restrict higher risk activities based on privileged users or groups. So we've reduced that surface area of exposure. And then for those who are granted access using the Netskope Cloud DLP, we can use not just classification tags that are commonly found in IaaS services, but we can take it a step further and use advanced techniques such as exact matching or file fingerprinting, object character recognition, optical character recognition, excuse me, as well as standard detection mechanisms like keyword and regular expressions and so forth. So the combination makes for a very robust mechanism of fine-grained detection of sensitive data in whether it's corporate IaaS services or even moving to unauthorized IaaS services. Approaching the end of the messaging here. So advanced threat protection, this is about taking objects that are either moving to or at rest in these buckets, these blobs, and scanning them for malicious payload. Now, the uniqueness that Netskope brings to this is not just that we're scanning for known malicious content based on its reputation, based on threat intelligence, even based on Netskope's cloud threat research team, which is a generator of such threat intelligence, but also to be able to detect malware that does not yet have a reputation, commonly referred to as zero-day. And so this requires techniques such as, I think it's referred to as detonating a payload in a controlled environment like a sandbox, or advanced heuristics analysis where we unpack executables and libraries and then analyze what sort of privileges and what activities they might be able to perform in a particular operating system. And of course, anomaly detection integrated with these detection capabilities. So summing it up, the advantages, the difference that Netskope Security Cloud for IaaS offers, we put it into 3 buckets. It is a multi-cloud dashboard and set of workflows to give a unified view of inventory and compliance across the various IaaS environments, with the ability to do analysis and reporting directly in the product. No need to export the data. Of course, I mentioned that is supported. It is a real-time access and activity control where a fine-grained capability, such as being able to detect and control that start or stop or upload or detach or share, those kinds of activities that move, those web APIs that move data, and even optionally engage the cloud's DLP to classify that data as sensitive or not as it's transacted with the AWS buckets, the Azure blobs, etc. And finally, it becomes a single cloud security platform, consistently implemented microservices native in the cloud for this set of policy controls and policy frameworks, one single set of policy, one single set of engines across all of the IaaS vendors, as well as expanding to other public services, as I mentioned earlier. So that's effectively the message, short and sweet, and I'll hand it back over to AccessIT. Thank you.
Livius, thank you very much. I appreciate the presentation and particularly the conversation around granular detection. I found particularly compelling. At this time, folks, what we'd like to do is transition to our Q&A. We have asked Nick, Mike, and Livius to stay on to answer some of those questions. We do have several questions that have been submitted in writing. We will address those first. And if we have time, we'll see if we can take any live questions. But right now, the first question is for Nick at CyberArk. Can CyberArk also help control access for outside or third-party vendors?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually a core use case for us. And in fact, while it's something that we've been doing for a long time, we actually have recently announced general availability of a new solution we call Alero, which is designed specifically to address third-party vendors where they may not have an identity within the corporate Active Directory. And it's a pretty unique offering that doesn't exist anywhere else in the marketplace. And we'd love to speak to anybody who has a vendor access need or a need to secure vendor access about some of the details around our new Alero product offering. So thanks for that question. That was a great one.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's see. The next couple are for Mike Morgan. Is Lumen available for Tenable SC customers?
Yes. Right now it is specific to Tenable.io, but I think as of, let's just say right before Christmas, we will look to make Lumen accessible to Tenable SC customers. Essentially what we'll be doing is using a connector to sync your data up to the cloud where it can be exposed to Lumen at that point and see it. And it'll just be using API keys to create that sync on whatever schedule and to whatever degree, whether it's just individual scan results or an entire repository is up to you.
Excellent. And then I have another here for Tenable Lumen benchmarking. Can that be used to compare internal business units as well?
Yeah, that's what I had highlighted a little bit, that the bottom portion of the screen that I was showing in Lumen was a business context view, and that's exactly what it's doing. It's utilizing the tags that you've created in Tenable.io. So best practices, for tagging would assume that you're looking at operating systems, environments, geos, users, any of those types of things that you would use to quantify and understand your environment. Those would be the tags that you'd want to pull into Lumen. And then you're right, it essentially gives you a report card of all your individual environments, users, assets, however you want to organize that for internal benchmarking. There'll be a lot more to come on that as we go into 2020.
Excellent. Mike, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I have a couple more questions. Livius, in reference to Netskope, can Netskope detect zero-day malware in my S3 buckets?
Absolutely, yeah. So once the access is granted cloud to cloud from the enterprise Netskope cloud to the enterprise, let's say AWS account, then the malware scanning can be established, and content at rest within the S3 bucket can be scanned and subjected to those zero-day detections I mentioned, such as cloud sandboxing, heuristic analysis, and several other types zero-day detection engines.
Absolutely, and I have another here you may have touched on as well. How would one prevent data from leaking to a personal AWS?
Great question, thanks. So when Netskope is used, the Cloud XD capability is used as an inline control. Then these web APIs exposed by, let's say AWS as an example, they're going to be available across multiple AWS accounts. And so Cloud XD is able to identify specific accounts or tenants, if you will, and then the policy framework can be bound to specific tenants. So one can have more privileged policies, real-time policies, for the corporate AWS tenant, and then have more restrictive policies, maybe block, maybe conditional allow, for the non-corporate, maybe authorized third-party AWS tenants, and perhaps even an outright block for personal AWS tenants. So that would be examples of use cases to prevent leakage to personal.
Excellent. Livius, thank you. I appreciate that. As we attempt to go ahead and transition to any live questioning, if we can make folks, participants live on the call at this time, I would at this point like to go ahead and thank again Livius Feinbaum, Principal Sales Engineer for Netskope, Mike Morgan, Senior Solutions Engineer for Tenable, Nick Dulevitz, National Director for Solution Engineering at CyberArk, and of course our own David Brown, VP of Professional Services for AccessIT Group. I believe we do have a question. I'll go ahead and read this one off in case we can't unmute the team. Can Netskope scan data or content being uploaded into an IaaS environment for malicious payloads before it hits cloud storage?
Yes, that's exactly a key use case for Cloud XD when it is in line. So the traffic would be steered through Netskope towards the destination cloud app. And as it's traversing through Netskope, think of it as a perimeter that's doing inspection of the session. And then the policies that you define, malware could be a policy, DLP could be a policy, access controls could be a policy. All of those can be evaluated, and then either a block or allow ultimate decision is made.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that. I will go ahead and make the comment at this time that if you do have additional questions, or if you'd like to keep the conversation going, please reach out to your AccessIT Group sales executive, and we're more than happy to continue this conversation with you. Again, just a bit of housekeeping. We will go ahead and document these questions, provide them to our panelists to provide full written responses, and then make those available to all of these attendees. So I'll go ahead and say, at this time, please raise your hand if there are any additional questions, but otherwise, I think we will go ahead and provide, oh, excuse me. I do have another question here from Joe. Will the slide decks be made available? We'll go ahead and confirm that with our attendees, and we'll reply with an after meeting response. I'll go ahead and go once around the room for the attendees. Any additional questions at this time? All right, again, I would like to thank everyone who joined us today. We approached almost 50 people on the line today, which is fantastic turnout. Again, our thanks to all of the panel attendees, and of course, also the folks who have joined us to learn about these three critical areas. Thank you very much for your time. I'll turn it back over to David Brown for any final comments.
All right, thank you, John. Thanks everyone for the time this afternoon now. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to anyone at AccessIT. We'd be happy to round them up and get you answers for them. Again, thanks for attending, and we hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll be closing the call at this time.